Hi, everybody. I'm so excited to be here with all of you and DMC and Michaels to make your own embroidered patch today. These little guys are, as you can see, pretty labor intensive. So we're going to go through all the steps to make your own that you can stitch or iron onto a denim jacket or a backpack, anything you might want to use them for later. So I'm going to show you how to make the grid and then how to template out your heart, stitch a few different types of stitches, and then even do a little iron-on backing. So we're going to go through all the steps. We might jump ahead a couple so you can follow through all the steps as you finish your patch, but that way you can see how to start and finish the whole thing. So you can see a couple different color options as well, depending on what colors you want to use. It's totally up to you. But I'm going to go through all of our supplies and then we'll get started. So firstly, I am using a embroidery hoop and some D.M.C embroidery needles. And then of course, embroidery floss. So I've got a my own little kit that I've put together here of all different D.M.C floss. I used a bright green, an olive green, sort of like a dusty pink color, and like a mustard brown. This is the color palette in our larger heart option, or you could just do shades of green if you wanted to do our smaller heart option. But again, you can use any colors that you prefer. So you could do them in just a simple black and white if you wanted to, or mix and match all different shades, maybe do a rainbow of checkerboard. Any colors would be great. As we all know, DMC has a billion colors. I'm sure that if you are an embroidery enthusiast like me, you've got a ton of different colors in your craft room already, or Michael's has all the colors you will need. And then we are going to be using some fabric. So I'm using what I call like Dropcloth Fabric. You can also use like a fiddler's cloth, any sort of embroidery fabric, or if you want to put this directly onto an article of clothing, you could definitely use that as well. Instead of being a patch, you could just stitch it directly in place. But I like this Dropcloth fabric. It's like a canvas. It's pretty thick, but it is also a like recycled, sustainable material. But it's got enough of like open weave that it's easy to embroider, but closed enough that you don't see all your holes as you go, even when you are doing a lot of different needlework. And then if you want to, you might have already printed out a little template here. These are just like a quick, easy heart template shape, but you could also draw your own heart if you want to. And then to make your grid, we are going to be using just a standard ruler and a black marker. One other optional step is you could use like a blue water-soluble ink pen if you wanted to erase your grid at the end. I personally like the little grid showing around the edge of the heart, but it's up to you. If you don't like that, you can do a water-soluble pen. Otherwise, you just use a black ink pen. And I think that's everything. Oh, you're gonna need scissors, of course. Scissors to cut your thread as well as to cut out our heart shape and our iron-on backing. The iron-on backing is an optional step, so I'm going to show you how to do that at the very end. We won't have enough time to complete all of the whole patch today, but we'll make a couple squares. We'll do the whole template, the back and like the outer edge of it, and then I'll show you how to do a backing on it once it's finished. So if you want to back it, I have just our iron-on backing. It rolls up pretty fast. So we got that, and then an iron and some sort of heat-safe surface. So a lot of times I can just put down a towel or an ironing board, whatever you prefer. And this like iron-on backing is from Michael's, of course, and it's really easy to use. So I'll show you that at the very end. Of course, as we mentioned, if you have any questions along the way, if you want to know more info on certain supplies, or if you are missing a supply and want an alternative, just put it in the Q&A and we will come up with an option for you. So I'm going to flip my camera around so you guys can see my hands and we can get started. So our first step we're going to do is actually making the grid. And to do that, we are going to use our fabric of choice and our ruler and our marker. And it's pretty simple. Let me get this in a little bit closer for this portion. We're going to make a grid that's over the entire piece of paper here. You can see I have an extra one here to show you what it will kind of look like when it's finished. We're going to measure out 1/2-inch marks and then draw lines for them to meet and then do it the other direction in order to make a little grid. This is going to be a really easy way to keep your line straight when you're embroidering, as well as I think, like I mentioned already, kind of like that little extra detail that the marker leaves. You can even, if you wanted to do one half finished, you could do something down the middle and not have the whole thing embroidered and leave half of it just gridded. I think leaves a fun little look. So to start, you're going to line up your fabric on one end and then line up your 0 line on your ruler at the edge of your fabric. I'm just kind of starting like an inch or so down. It doesn't really matter where you start to begin with here. It's totally up to you. We're going to cover the whole thing. So I'm going to measure 1/2 inch in and do a little mark. And then I'm going to keep my ruler in the same spot and then mark 1/2 inch going all the way across. So I'm just going from 1/2 inch to 1/2 inch mark. And for our hearts that we're making today, the patches aren't huge. And so I'm only using this small piece of fabric, but you could do the same technique on a larger piece if you ended up wanting to make a bigger embroidered work later. And then, so I've got my first line here of all my little 1/2 inch dashes. I'm going to move down a couple inches, like halfway or so down. I'm going to do the same thing. So lining up my 0 marker on my ruler and then going in 1/2 inch and then every 1/2 inch from there. So your little fabric piece should look like this right now, if you're following along in the moment. And then I'm going to flip my fabric and I'm going to use my ruler or my straight edge to line up these 2 dash marks that we just measured out. I'm going to take my marker and run it across. And we're going to do this all the way down our fabric to create lines across the whole thing. And you can see my little dash marks because they've been drawn over a couple of times are darker. I'm not worried about that because our embroidery is going to cover the majority of the lines we're drawing. So those little details you won't see at the end. And as I mentioned at the beginning, you could be doing the same exact pattern technique with any type of marker you might want. If you want to use a water soluble pen from D.M.C, that would work. And then at the end, you would just wet your patch to make all the extra marks disappear. Or if you wanted to do it in a color, I really like these little Papermate pins. They absorb really well on the fabric and they don't tend to smear. So I like to use those, but they come in a ton of colors, so you could get the the multi-pack at Michael's, and that would be an easy solution if you wanted to do different colors. I just split my fabric just to get these last couple of little marks here. Now I've got my whole piece of fabric here with lots of little lines going down. And now we're going to do the exact same thing we did with our little dashes, but in the opposite direction. So now along one of these lines, I'm going to measure little 1/2 inch marks again. So I'm just kind of lining up again with the edge of one of my lines here. And then at the 1/2 inch, I'm going to make more little marks all the way down. And then I'm going to come down a few lines. Lining this up so it's going to match up together, and then just marking your 1/2 inch. Because we're making our own grid, that's what's great, is that you can really use any type of material you might want. Doesn't matter if you have which direction your grain is going on your fabric or anything like that. We're going to go with our own little format and our own pattern that we're building. So then we're going to do the same thing we did, and we're going to line up these new hash marks all the way down our fabric. We'll start to see our little squares and grid appear. If you haven't made a grid like this before, this is definitely an easy like pattern to create if you want to do any sort of checkerboard work. And so you can recreate the same patch over and over again, but in a ton of different ways. So today we're obviously making a heart, but you can make a star or a smiley face or lettering all in the same grid pattern. I feel like learning how to do something like this is sort of like a little entry step to offer you lots of future options. Again, I'm just going to flip this over just to get the last couple of lines here. And there's our completed grid. Got all sorts of little squares. As you can see, all of these squares will now be embroidered. And so the next step would be to put on our template. Might have a little printed out one at home. I'm going to cut out this little small heart. You can definitely draw your own heart if you didn't print out a template, or if you want to do a different style heart than this one. But this is just a great little option for a traditional style heart. And I'm using the smallest option on our template handout for today, but you can use any size you want, and any of those would fit in like this little, just like 8x8 space easily. Okay, so then you can see our little template can fit easily on our fabric. And then I'm going to trace this heart with my marker as well. So it's up to you when you're working on this grid sort of style, if you want to have a line go directly down the heart. And so then I would line up the point of my heart with this little inner point at the top down one of the lines. Or if you want to shift it over a little bit so that then one of the squares is at the center of the heart, it's totally up to you and what your personal preference is. I think for here, I'm going to kind of line it up. I like to get a little bit of a square in the little humps, so it's not, doesn't finish out, but rather is going into a new square. Just a compositional option. And I'm just going to lay down my little paper heart and then trace around it with my black marker. There you've got your little heart. So now we're ready to start embroidering, the thing you all came for. So we're going to start by setting this in our hoop. And if you are new and you haven't used an embroidery hoop before, you're going to unscrew the little mechanism at the top here. Screws back and forth to loosen or tighten the two hoops together. So an embroidery hoop is made up of two different pieces. You've got your inner hoop, that's just a solid piece of wood, and then your outer hoop that has the little screw mechanism on top. You might have a wood one or a plastic one. There's multiple options from Michaels and D.M.C. It's totally up to you what style you like. Sometimes if you wanted to use this as like a framed option, you can get like pretty like walnut stained wood ones and things like that that are also really great. But since we're taking ours out, we just have our generic little loops and thread one here. So I'm going to set this in our hoop by placing the inner hoop or the solid hoop underneath our fabric. And then I did this a little bit toward the edge, so I'm not going to be directly centered, but I want to make sure that my edge of my fabric is overlapping the wooden ring. I'm going to lay my outer hoop on top. And then it sandwiches your fabric inside. And then you want to give it a little twist at the top to start to tighten those together. I like to kind of pick it up and make sure that it's all tight in there. And then just tight. And then as you go, kind of pull just gently on the edges of your fabric. You don't want to pull so tight that you're warping the fabric. If you start to see any of the weave of the fabric like stretching out, you probably pulled too tight. And when you remove it from your hoop, it could be a little bit like distorted. So you want to make sure that you're pulling it just tight enough that it has like a little bit of like a bounce to it when you tap it, but not so tight that it's stretching. So again, just kind of making sure that it's nicely in here. And now we're ready to start embroidering. So we can start with our outer edge, and I like to use a black for a patch. I think it gives it that traditional patch look, but you don't have to. You could definitely do one of your base colors that you're using in your patch. And I'm going to remove a couple of feet and then trim that off of my little skein here of embroidery thread. And then for the outside edge, I'm going to use all 6 pieces of thread. So any embroidery skein is made up of 6 individual tiny threads. And for the inner portion of the patch, when we start to fill in the squares, I'm going to split this into 3 threads. I just think that that gives a cleaner look. But for the outer edge, I like it to be a little bit thicker. So I'm going to use all 6 of them. And then I'm going to use our D.M.C needles here. Can use any size you prefer. I like a lot of times like a size 5, I think feels the best for me, but you can use a longer one if you prefer it. Any of those will work. So I've got a little embroidery 5 here. And then there's a couple options to thread your needle. You can sometimes when you just cut it, it might be nice and crisp. You can just push it right through the eye of your needle. You can also use one of these little guys. If you don't have one in your kit, it's a great one to have handy. Show you how to use this little needle threader. So what you'll do is put one end the little hook end inside the eye of the needle. Hold that on there. And then wrap your thread around the hook. And then pull that through the eye. And then you can take that hook off. Sometimes if you're dealing with like this multiple threads, you're having trouble getting it in a needle, or if the eye of your needle is really tiny, you can use a little needle threader to help. Okay, so I'm going to pull my thread down a few inches here. And then on the other end, I'm going to tie a double or triple knot. I'm going to trim that little tail off. Okay, so now I've got my needle thread set here. We're through our eye of our needle. We've got a knot on the other end. And then we're going to start from the back. So when you're embroidering, you're always going to have a knot on one side, which means you're always going to start from the back of your hoop so that the knot is on the back side of your artwork. And with practice, it gets easier and easier to know where you're kind of blindly sticking your needle through. But I think you can easily kind of start to poke it through the front and start to see where you're at, because obviously your pattern's on the front and not on the back. But so you just kind of want to pick a spot, and I'm just going to kind of push through until my needle is on the line of my heart. I'm going to pull it all the way through until my knot is tight on the back. And then we're going to do a back stitch all the way around the edge of the heart. So I'm going to go up a stitch length, pull it back through to the back. And then I'm going to go up a stitch length from the back side. Again, I'm just kind of tapping my finger and my needle through until I see where I want it to be. I'm going to pull that through. And now I'm going to go back a stitch. So I'm going to go back down to meet the last stitch I just made to connect them and build a line. And you're going to do that all the way around your heart and just keep going forward a stitch and then back a stitch. You can always build this line up as well if you want to. Like I mentioned, we're using all 6 threads, so this is going to be a thicker line already. But at the end, you can always do an extra row of back stitches all the way around it if you want to make a thicker border, which I think only adds to the kind of classic patch quality with that like thicker black border. Look nice and professional, and people want to know where you bought it, not where you made it. So keep stitching around. And as I mentioned, you can use a different color. So if you're stitching along with me at home and you're using a different color than black for your border, put it in the Q&A. Let us know what color you might be using. I'd love to know. Another reason I like this kind of fabric, I don't know if you can kind of hear it, it really kind of pops as it punctures through the fabric. But it's thick enough that it doesn't really have a lot of give. So if you make a mistake, you can kind of rework it over and over again, and it's going to be fine. It doesn't overly stretch. Like I said, that's just like recycled drop cloth material. I like to make sure I'm keeping sort of small stitches all the way around as I go. That will keep your uh, fabric in um, like secure as well. Once you're finished, we're going to you'll trim your heart and cut it out of the rest of your fabric. And that will leave a little bit of like loose fabric edges, which again leaves that little extra border showing and that like touch of hand that I think is really pretty. But you want to make sure that you are doing small enough stitches along the border here versus just one big stitch over each kind of straight line to keep all of your fabric secure. Kind of creates a little barrier along the edge. Okay, we're almost done with our outline already. Just doing simple back stitch all the way around. And the back stitch is probably my most used stitch. Anytime you want something to be like a solid line, doing like wording, things like that, the back stitch is great. And there you've got the first outline ready to go. So we're going to tie this off on the back. And to do that, I like to go underneath a stitch on the back, pull your thread until you have a little loop, and then pop your needle through that loop, and then pull tight. It's a really easy little knot and secures it in there. I'm going to do that a second time. I'm going to go under a stitch, wait for a loop, go through my loop, and then pull tight. And trim off your excess. And there you've got the start of your heart patch ready to go. Okay, so I'm going to remove the rest of my black thread there. And we're going to do a square together to get our patches started. And we can start with any color you might want. Of course, I mentioned our like little sample one here of just two colors. I'm going to stick with our olive green and bright green color combo. I'm going to pull off a couple of feet. You're probably going to have to reload your needle again to finish the stitches or the squares, but I don't like to pull off too much at first. Personally, I feel like you just end up with a knot or your thread starts to get a little bit too separated. So I like to just keep it within a couple of feet at most. I'm gonna trim that off from my rest of my skein. And then here's where we're going to separate our thread. So again, all embroidery thread has 6 individual threads. So you're going to separate it. Want to pull it apart to get 3 and 3. And then just slowly pull both sides apart. Sometimes if I'm sitting on the couch, I'll hold one part between my legs, my knees, which is probably where most of us like to embroider. I just want to kind of slowly separate it. Don't pull too fast, it will just kind of twist and knot. So just go a little bit slow if it starts to twist. Just untangle that a little bit and stretch it out. And then you've got two pieces of thread here. You'll be able to use both. So we're going to start with just the first one. So I've got my 3 threads. I'm going to push that through the eye of my needle. And then again, we're going to tie a knot on the opposite end of our thread. And now we're working with just 3 threads, which means our knot's even smaller. So I'm going to do at least a triple knot. Depending on the type of fabric you might be using, if you're using something like a fiddler's cloth that might be a little bit more of an open weave, or if you're using like a gauze material, then I would definitely make sure that you're doing a larger knot. But if you're using like this, or little canvas, or even like denim, a double, triple knot at the most will be fine. Okay, so we're going to start the same way we did with our border, which is from the back. And we're going to fill in one of our squares here. Since we're starting with our first color, we're just doing a 2-tone checkerboard. So basically, wherever we start, we're going to do every other, this one color of green, and then we'll rotate that onto the next row. So I'll show you here. So we're going to start here. I'm going to start along this middle row of squares. I'm going to do this little half square on the right side. So I'm going to start from the back. And because we're filling in the entire square with the same color green, I'm not worried about where I'm starting because we're going to do kind of a long and short stitch. So you could do a straight satin stitch, which is going to be starting at the top and going all the way to the bottom. But I like to see a little bit more variety in my stitches. And so you can see in this little sample patch, there's different areas of where we've stitched in that it overlaps. So it's not one flat solid line, but you actually get a little bit of texture because we're doing long and short stitches over and over again. So to do that, we're going to start wherever you kind of want in your first square. So I'm just going to pop right in the middle of my first square here. I'm going to pull it till I hit my knot. And then I'm going to go up to my line. And I'm going to try to keep my needle as straight so that my threads will be straight up and down. Got our first little bright green stitch in there. And then I'm just going to go a little bit lower, kind of pop it in the middle and go back up, keeping my stitches as straight as possible so that everything's going really nice and vertical. That's going to keep your long and short stitches neat, so that we're creating texture, but it's organized chaos rather than every stitch going different directions. All of these are going to be going vertically to fill in the entire square, but it still gives a little bit of variety and texture to your overall piece. So you can see I'm varying my stitch lengths, some being longer, some being shorter. You can pop one right in the middle, overlapping, come down to the bottom. And that's how we're going to fill in these squares. So you don't have to go in exact order from just left to right. I kind of like the freedom of kind of bouncing around a little bit, filling it in as I go. If I see I've got a little bit of a gap here, I can just add another stitch in between the previous ones. And we're going to go all the way to the edge. And then I'm going to start cutting through this portion that I've started to fill in, and then come down to the bottom line. So you can start to see how these stitches are kind of overlapping. a little knot in there. Just stretch it out again. See, we're starting to build in our color. And once you get the hang of this, you can definitely do a ton of different types of stitches to fill in the same pattern. So if you wanted to do a solid satin stitch, you would start at the top line and go all the way down to the bottom line to have one single stitch all the way down. So that's definitely an option. You could also go horizontally instead of vertically. Can mix and match stitch styles also. I always think that that's a fun look. As we get to the edge of our border here, we're staying within our black line. Sometimes if you put your needle a little bit more horizontally, you can kind of get pushed right underneath the line. And it looks as if the black line is almost on top of that green edge. There we have our first square is already finished. So if you wanted to, depending on how much length of thread you still have on your needle, you could definitely just move down diagonally to your next light green, or you could tie it off here. So I'm just gonna move down to this next green one. You could bounce over as well. I just like to try to keep the back side as organized as possible. So moving to the next closest square will do that for you. And then you're going to keep stitching the same way. And kind of long and short stitches all the way across. As you start to run out of thread, I always like to make sure you still have a couple inches on the back so you can tie a little knot. And we're going to do the same thing. So I'm going to go underneath a stitch, pull my needle through, and right before I pull it all the way, leaves a little loop. Place your needle through that loop and then pull it tight. And then just you can do that again if you want to. The good thing about this is that we are going to back it if you want to for an iron-on, or you can stitch it directly onto whatever surface you want it to live on. So I'm not as worried about the knots on the back. You want to make sure that it's secure, but it's not really going to be used or moved around a lot once it's attached to your final destination. And I'm going to release my needle and trim that off. You can see we're starting to build that up here. I'm going to do a dark green one next, just so we can start to see that pattern building. Again, cutting a couple of feet off, and then we're going to separate our thread, because it takes a second to get 3 and 3. You can just go a little slow and untwist. And remember, even though we've separated these threads, these are not your trash pile. So you want to make sure if you are using something like this, sometimes I'll put my extra bits back in their little color home, because those are ready to go and ready to use. Okay, so again, we're going to thread our needle with our olive green. And then tie a knot on the other end, just like we did with the other colors. Okay, and of course, we're going to start from the back. So if we wanted to continue this line, just kind of start to see these colors next to each other and build out our checkerboard pattern. So I'm going to start from the back side. Again, so I just kind of like tap my needle until I see where it needs to be, pop it through, pull it until it's tight on the back, and then go up to your border line and start filling in the next square of color. Again, doing varying long and short stitches to give you that textured look. As you get close to one another, just want to make sure that you're filling in the entire space. You don't want any of that canvas to show through, but you also don't want to necessarily overlap each other. So just be really careful as you go into like a corner. Take your time. And that way it will give you nice crisp lines on every one of your squares. I'm varying my length, kind of going just one next to each other. But again, you don't have to. If you wanted to bounce over, if you push your needle through and it's not directly next to it, just keep going. You don't need to worry about if it's the exact one, the exact line next to it. All of it kind of is going to blur together. No one knows which one you started with. You can see we're filling in that square. And I'm kind of doing a little bit like the top half, and then we'll come back and kind of fill in that bottom half to overlap my stitches. And for this pattern, because we are filling it in solid with one color, if you aren't happy with a stitch, of course, you can always remove it. You can go from the back and pull a stitch out and start over. But you also, if you're like, oh, that one's not as straight, just keep going and overlap it. I think adding the thickness of the stitching, you can start to see it's hard to see on camera, but it's just creating a thicker layer. And so I think if you have a little bit overlapping, just adds to that look, which is really pretty and takes a little bit of the stress out of it. We're almost done with that one. See, I'm just going to again tie this off. I can rethread my needle, go through a stitch, leave a loop and tie tight.
Hey Tessa,
Yeah.
there's a question. Does the fabric become loose and you have to tighten the hoop?
Sometimes, yeah. So if you are struggling with that, if you you might not have tightened it tight enough to start with, and also sometimes the back and forth and pulling on it, it just starts to wear a little bit. So you can always pop it in and out. So if your fabric is loose and you're like, oh no, it's falling out, just remove it, untighten this a little bit, and re-tighten your hoop.
Awesome.
So you don't have to feel, especially this, really with any embroidery project, you're just gonna pop it back in your hoop, pull it tight again, and then give it a couple extra twists at the top. So you can push it in and out of your hoop if you need to, and it won't mess up the stitches or the progress you've already made. That way you don't have to feel so precious about it. That's what I think is so fun about embroidery, is that it's really hard to make a mistake, in my opinion. All of these stitches we just made, if we wanted to, we could cut them all out and the fabric would hardly be noticeable that we've put all of these holes in it, and we could start over. Or you could overlap, as they'd already said, so you can kind of mix things around and it doesn't matter if you made a mistake, just keep going. Okay, so again, we're going to add a little bit more thread into eye of our needle.
Question. What about doing the second color stitches across rather than up and down?
Oh, I think it's a great idea. You could absolutely vary your stitches. So if you wanted to, you would do the exact same thing we've been doing, just going horizontally instead of vertically. I think that would give like a really pretty like look and interest to your patch. So you could totally do that. I love that idea. And again, yeah, if you wanted to, I can show you on this one. Of course, we only have the time of an hour together, unfortunately, but so we're not going to finish our whole patch. So I can kind of show you if you wanted to do that, you would start the same way, but instead of going up, you would just go left and go to again, I'm still varying my stitch lengths. I'm just going horizontally instead of vertically. But of course, as you can see, even vertically, our stitches, different colors still meet the same way to another color. So you're just changing the orientation of where they're going to, of how they're going to lay. But the overall finished product will look very similar. But I think that it's fun to be able to switch it up. So you definitely don't have to stick with just one. Just gonna go back and forth. Course, you can be as meticulous in your stitches as you want to. If you like to go stitch by stitch, maybe it's my organized chaos mind. I kind of like to jump back and forth a little bit. For some reason, it makes it feel like it goes faster to me. I can start to see the finished product earlier somehow. but it's totally up to you. There's no wrong way, especially doing these long and short stitches. They end up all becoming kind of one solid look at the end. So you can kind of see the difference in a vertical stitch versus a horizontal stitch. Still going to have clean borders. You're going to be able to line up all these edges. And so, yeah, you could definitely vary them, doing maybe one color in vertical and one color in horizontal, or you can mix and match throughout the whole patch. Okay, so that kind of gives you quite a few options. Getting started on building your pattern, you can start to see already as we're building this where our colors are going to land. This, of course, will be like a little lime green one in the middle. Sometimes I like to do little cuttings at the end and kind of see, or as you go from the start to kind of see where your colors will land. Or you can do more varied colors like we did with our other sample one here, of course, where we're incorporating 4 shades instead of just 2, still in a checkered pattern. Okay, so I'm gonna tie this one off on the back. Just gonna run out of thread. And then I'm gonna show you how to cut this out. So when you're finished with your patch, you can see already in a short amount of time together, we've been able to not only make our pattern, but I've already filled in a couple of squares. And so especially using the smaller style, it goes pretty quickly, which is fun, that you can kind of knock out a patch in an evening or over the course of a couple of evenings, depending on how quick or how much time you have to spend on it. But once you are finished and your patch is filled in all the way, you're going to release it from your hoop, and then you're going to cut it out. And so I would not do this step until you're done, because once this is cut out, you won't be able to put it back in your hoop. So you want to make sure that your patch is like really all the way filled in and you're done embroidering. And when you are, I'm going to cut right through, and I'm going to leave like maybe a quarter of an inch of fabric around the outer edge of my black border. If you get too close to your black border, your threads can actually come out and start to like loosen your stitches. But this gives you that little border that we talked about at the beginning, as well as holds all of your stitches in nicely. And that's ultimately how you'll get from this to this. And then if you want to do an iron-on backing, I'm going to show you how to do that. I'm going to plug in my iron real quick. If you at home are using an iron as well, going to want to plug that in. I'm sure most of us are not done with our stitch. As we can see, we made quite a bit of progress. But if you want to use an iron on fabric at the end, since this one is finished, show you how we would attach that on the back, which also adds a little bit of extra durability to the backing of it and to your fabric from loosening up at all. So to do that, I've got my little iron-on material here. And the iron-on material comes, it's kind of two-sided. Move this up a little bit. And so there's a textured side and a smooth side. And we're going to want the textured side attached to the back of your material. So this textured side kind of melts at the end, and then this backing comes off as it melts. So what we're going to do is I'm going to place my heart on top of my iron-on backing, and then using my marker, I'm going to outline my shape. It doesn't have to be exact, because you actually want it to maybe be even a tiny bit smaller or just to the edge. We've got like a light little mark here. Let's cut off this extra. And I'm going to cut just on the inside edge of my line. The goal of that is that you don't have any extra sticking out. You want to make sure that it is, again, just a tiny bit smaller. So where you outlined, I'm just going to cut right on the inside edge. Not cutting a lot off, just a teeny bit. I've got my little heart here. You can see these together line up nicely. And then you can either be on an ironing board, or I just have a little towel here that you can put on top of any work surface. I'm gonna make sure something that will hold the heat. And then I'm gonna flip over a portion of my towel. Do this. I'm going to lay my heart down with the backing up, and then I can flip over an edge of my towel to hold it in place, and then take your iron directly onto the top of that. I'm going to move it around a little bit. You don't want to burn your surface, of course, but also you do need to leave it for a couple of moments. So I like to kind of give it a little wiggle. I like to use a towel because it's so easy to flip over one corner. You can easily lay it on top of the patch, and that gives a little bit of a heat barrier between your actual iron and your patch. Since this material is what's melting basically underneath your patch, if it gets on your iron, it's going to stick to your iron. So I'd rather it stick to my towel if a little bit comes off the edges. So just for a couple moments here, you can start to see already it's all flattened out and it's starting to stick. It still needs a couple more minutes. At this point too, you can always check it and make sure if it shifted at all. You could trim an edge if you needed to. But at this point, it still needs to cool, but I can still see a little bit of separation. So I'm going to pop it back under there for another minute. Doesn't take a ton of time. Like I said, even if you wanted to stitch on your patch at the end, I think sometimes you can still add this iron-on backing. It will kind of hold all of your threads in place, and you could still stitch through it if you wanted to, but it's great that it's easy to iron onto like any surface. I've done my patches on hats, backpacks, aprons, denim. It'll really stick to anything. And as long as you hold it on long enough and let it fully cool before you mess with it much, I've been able to like machine wash things with it on, and I haven't had any problems. Even with your patches, all of this is like a cotton thread, so you can absolutely wash it. Make sure that you either have it backed on something else, or your knots are tight. But I've done tons of embroidery on my clothing and machine washed it and no problems. All right, so we've got another moment here. Sometimes you want to make sure it will be hot, so definitely take your time to look at it. Still needs another minute. You see here, we've got a nice seal directly on there, sticking. And then once it cools, it's still hot, but when it cools, you can pull off this paper backing. And now you can see this sort of like translucent, that is actually like a melting adhesive. So now it's stuck to your actual patch, but this will be easy to stick onto anything else. So that at that point, you'd flip it over and put whatever material you want underneath it, whether you want to do a jacket, a backpack, anything like that. Put this on that material, do the same thing, cover it with a towel and iron it again, the opposite direction. And you can leave this backing on there. Maybe you want to give it as a gift, or you're not sure where you want to use your patch yet. Just leave the paper backing on there. It'll protect this little iron-on layer. And then when you're ready to add it on, it'll be waiting for you. And there are all of your steps to make your own iron-on patch. I hope that you guys had fun. I know I definitely did. And I'm excited to hopefully craft with you all again soon. So thanks so much for joining me and DMC and Michaels, and looking forward to crafting with you soon. Thanks.